Welcome everyone to today's ILTA webinar session entitled Generative AI, Build or Buy. I'm your moderator today, Jennifer Mendez, and I'm thrilled to be joined by the fabulous Nikki Shaver, CEO and co-founder of Legal Technology Hub. Thanks so much for being here, Nikki.
Thanks, Jennifer, for having me. I'm equally thrilled to be moderated by the fabulous Jennifer Mendez.
So, I mean, I feel like we can't have any legal tech sessions nowadays without talking about generative AI. And obviously, you have been keeping your finger on the pulse, really on top of this. And I thought this was a really great topic to talk about with you. So let's go ahead and jump right in. How should firms evaluate whether or not to build or buy a generative AI solution?
I think that sounds like a simple question, but it's really not a simple question for a number of different reasons. So maybe I'll just start by breaking it down a little bit. When you talk about build or buy, what does that mean? And the reason I think it's important to break that down is because from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of many commentators now in the industry, build versus buy doesn't mean the same thing that it used to mean. So previously in firms, when you talked about build versus buy, it was a fairly easy framework. You would look to see what you have internally at the firm and whether it was adequate for addressing the use case that you're working on. If not, you might go to market and see if there is a third-party solution. If there wasn't one that was exactly on point, could you partner with a vendor in order to support a build around that? And if nothing else was available, then perhaps you might move into building, recognizing that there was tech debt that you would be creating by doing so, and that the very next year there might be a third-party solution that emerges onto market, and you may need to pivot after spending time and resources building. In other words, build, generally speaking, is not the ideal place to go when you're a law firm. You don't have top-notch developers. It's not your bread and butter, unless there is a very specific, strategic, competitive reason to do so. With generative AI, especially what we saw last year when really it was all brand new, when people are talking about build versus buy, they're not talking about build like build an entirely new platform from scratch. No one, or perhaps very few firms that I know of, when they're talking about building, really we're talking about building an entire large language model from scratch. What they're talking about is deploying a foundational large language model in a way that made it secure internally. So the build component was building or leveraging a secure sandbox environment that allowed you to leverage a large language model through an API and thereby deploy it securely, rather than allowing your lawyers to work on a chat GPT on the internet, which obviously not secure when you're working from a law firm. So I think that that's an important distinction, because from my perspective, really the discussion then is, should you buy a third-party solution that has been built on GPT or another large language model and already has built out use cases, or should you deploy a foundational model through a secure sandbox and make that available for the purposes of experimentation? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, because as you said, it's not like they're actually creating their own large language models. We are deploying an existing model. Exactly. 9 times out of 10. I don't know any. I say 9 times out of 10 because maybe there is a firm that's done it. I
think there's one firm that is looking to build from scratch, but that I think is very unusual, and that's a different discussion. I don't think that's what the majority are really looking into.
Agreed. I mean, I don't know many firms that have the budget for developers with this unique skill set, and then everyone that comes around it, right? Your prompt engineers and everything else. So I appreciate the distinction. And so obviously there are advantages and disadvantages to both, right? As you said, you have some vendors that have already done the work. They already have a corpus. They're pointing it to specific content, whether it's case law or regulations or whatever it is. But there are also benefits to deploying your own solution and pointing it to your own content. So what are the things that we should be considering when making that decision? Advantages and disadvantages of deploying something on your own via API or purchasing a third-party solution that may not meet all of your needs, but maybe the majority of them.
I think it comes down to what it always has come down to, really, which is what are your internal needs and what's your strategic approach to AI as well. So if you know that you have specific use cases internally that are adequately addressed by a third-party solution that has already launched to market, has reliable features that address those use cases leveraging generative AI, of course, that's a viable option for you and one that should be explored, and that sounds attractive if it stacks up against your other options. If you're in a position where what you want is to make generative AI widely available to your lawyer base so that they can experiment and you can identify specific use cases internally before you perhaps go to market for something that has been specifically built out to address those use cases, then leveraging a foundational model internally may be a better bet. I will say there are a few other things to consider. One is if you use something like the enterprise version of ChatGPT, you may be able to now secure that internally, but you're still retaining some of the features of ChatGPT that make it problematic for use within legal environments in some ways. For example, it has not been trained on sound legal data. So for the purposes of legal research, it is not suitable. Even for the purposes of something like summarization of legal documents, it's really important that the model you're working with has been trained to understand legal concepts in a way that supports high-level professional legal work, and ChatGPT is not. So those are considerations. There are ways that you can adapt a foundational model leveraged through an API in order to make it more suitable for legal work. You can fine-tune it on data sets. You can leverage RAG, retrieval augmented generation, which will allow you to point it at specific internal data sets. But that does then require some resources, some technical resources. So another question to ask yourself is, if you want to go beyond experimentation and use case identification to provide a tool that's actually productively useful to your lawyers, do you have the technical resources to build around the foundation model the kinds of functions and features that will make it useful in that way or not?
One of the things that I've noticed recently, I mean, obviously, it feels like every vendor that reaches out to us is talking about how they're incorporating Gen AI into their solution. So I feel like it's becoming more commonplace and will continue to do so. But one of the things that I've been seeing more frequently is, hey, we've built this solution that leverages Gen AI, and we give you the opportunity to also bring in your own content. So you're not just relying on our corpus of data that we've populated. You can teach the large language model yourself with the content that you have. What are your thoughts on that approach, where you're both buying and sort of not necessarily building, but contributing to the large language model?
It depends, I think, on what form that takes in terms of being able to leverage your own data. That's always beneficial, typically. I have heard mixed reports about whether or not the efficacy of a model is improved through actually reinforcing the training model with your firm's own data. I think what tends to be more practically useful is the ability to restrict for a particular query the model's attention to a specific data set. And if that's what we're talking about, then I think that's really beneficial. And yes, that's a nice midway point. I also think that this is not a strict dichotomy. We did some surveying of firms at the end of last year and focusing just on AmLaw 100 responses, because we did also look at the Canadian, Australian, and UK markets. But AmLaw 100, of the firms that responded, 75% had piloted a third-party solution of the kind of nature of an AI legal assistant, so a co-counsel or a Harvey. And approximately 60% had leveraged a foundational model through an API. Now, if you look at those statistics, there certainly is overlap between the two. In other words, a significant number of the firms that jumped in with AI initiatives last year did not just either pilot a third-party tool or leverage a foundation model internally. They did both. And I think that makes sense because last year was a year for real experimentation on many fronts. We were trying to understand what this technology does, how it would benefit our lawyers. So looking at what was on the market in all different respects made a lot of sense. I imagine this year we're going to see a little bit more of firms making a specific decision. This is how we're going to move ahead. Having said that, like you mentioned, Jennifer, there are a ton of existing legal technology vendors now building additional features or reevaluating their underlying tech stacks and building with generative AI or other types of advanced AI. And so inevitably, it's not going to be what one generative AI solution are you using. A lot of the technology you already license at your firm will also already be using generative AI, including, of course, Lexis and Bloomberg and Thomson Reuters. So I think this is not going to be an if or question. It's going to be a, look at your tech stack, evaluate where it makes sense to be leveraging generative AI. Some of that will be in third-party products, but you may also wish to have something that is specific that you can tailor to your firm.
So I love that. If 2023 was the year of exploration and 2024 is the year of implementation and making decisions, how can firms ensure that their AI projects are successful, regardless of whether they build, buy, or a mix of both?
That's a good question. And I think where last year, some of the rules and the frameworks that we've used were put to one side because we were in this necessary realm of experimentation, playing, R&D. We're now back to those frameworks. So it comes back to, okay, what is useful? What do your lawyers spend time on? What are your firm's overarching strategic goals? What's important to you from a growth perspective? Which practices are under the most pressure or are most important competitively for the firm? What use cases from those practices are most critical? What are the tools that address those in the most effective way possible? And then leveraging and making decisions accordingly. And firms will have a multi-pronged approach to do those things, but that's not anything new. It's the way that we've been dealing with technology and making procurement decisions for a long time. So I think it's maybe time to come off the hype train and look at this as this is another technology, and it's not like a tool. It's a type of technology that is being used in many, many different ways. I think the one interesting thing that will be happening this year as well is 100% of firms that we surveyed said they would be looking at their tech stacks this year to evaluate them. Because if you are deploying, for example, an AI legal assistant, it commonly will do many different things. And that means there's increased overlap now in your tech landscape. And maybe it's time to let go of some of the solutions where the vendors haven't acted rapidly to upgrade their underlying technology, and maybe some of these newer solutions that you're already deploying do those things better. On the other hand, perhaps there are some AI legal assistants where the technology looks really fancy, but there isn't a UI componentry around it to really allow for it to be deployed effectively at scale in order to do things within a lawyer's workflow such that it will be adopted broadly across a firm. And I think that will become more important this year as well.
Yes, I definitely think we're going to be talking about adoption and change management and training and all the things that come with deploying a solution, which is part of our jobs, right? And the things that we've been doing for so long as we evaluate and implement technology tools. Nikki, thank you so much for your insights. I think it was a great conversation. I always appreciate talking to you. Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed the session.
Thanks so much.